Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. Today we're going to service this lovely Bianchi Infinito. What a lovely road bike this one is. We're going to change the chain on this one. We're going to service the bike right through. We're going to sort out some details where it's had paint spilt on it. We're going to adjust all the gears, service all the components on it, clean that cassette up and really get this bike riding nicely. We're also going to true the wheel. You can see here that the wheel is rubbing on a brake block one side, so it's spinning freely until it gets to the buckle and is then catching that brake block. We're going to also sort out this puncture here. You can see we've got a flat tire on this bike when it arrived and it's got a little bit of debris. You can see that little nip on the tire there, and there's actually a little bit of debris in there that we're going to take out before we put the new tube in there. And in fact on this one, the rear wheel, the tire was actually rotating the wrong way around. So you can see here clearly the chain has worn out. Great to get a chain checker into your arsenal of bicycle care. That way you can check your chain for wear before it wears out the remainder of your components. So I'm going to take that chain off and discard that, put a new one on there. And now I'm going to take all the components off this bike. You can see here the quick release was very tight. I'm going to make sure that that's at the correct tension when it goes back on. Look at how tight this is. I actually couldn't undo this cassette. It was so tight, it way over tightened at some point in its life. That's why all these things have a torque setting. That's why it's a great idea to get your bike serviced so that you can get all those correct and that you're not going to damage threads and damage lock nuts and components on the bike by having them over tightened. So that's now undone. We had to use a breaker bar there, you saw, and you can see there's a nice thick residue of oil on this bike. It actually did this bike a favour. The customer was telling me that they haven't ridden for 3 years due to neck injury and neck problems, and this was a recommissioning and reinstatement of this bike. So actually the lubricant that was on the bike served to protect this bike while it was standing. Now we didn't want to change the cables on this bike. They were actually shifting really nicely. Campagnolo is just a gem of a group set, so I'd knocked off the end on that cable because I'm going to reuse it in this instance. And you can see here again on the rear derailleur a build up of wet oil, which I personally wouldn't ride a bike as wet as this, but actually for a bike that's been stored for 3 years, it stored it perfectly. It actually came up really nice. Again on the front derailleur there, you can see it's a little bit wet, a little bit grimy, needs a clean, needs re-lubricating, but boy did it protect it. FSA cranks, they're the unsung heroes really of the cycling world. Very little talk really about FSA as a brand, but actually you see them a lot. They're a lovely chain set that comes apart nicely. Everything there was perfect. You can see we just need to give this a little bit of a clean up. There's no wear. The bearings have been rotating on the shaft nicely. There's no under rotation marks on the shaft there, so everything on that bottom bracket is perfect. The bearings were good, so we can reuse everything there without any issues. Off come the brakes, and once all the brakes are off, we'll then start to clean everything up. So again, as I mentioned, we want to reuse the cable. Nice thing about this Campagnolo is that you can remove the cables without removing the ends, so that's great for us. That means we haven't got to replace those. Now this bike had a splash of paint down it, as you can see here. During its storage time, a bit of paint had gone down the frame, down the wheel and across the brake caliper itself. So we did a couple of test patches here with various cleaners that we used before we found the right one that was going to clean this off fairly easily without any problems for us. So you can see here how that paint has really hit this caliper, so this is going to need a good clean up and get that paint off of there. Such a shame on such a lovely bike, but actually it didn't cause us too much of a problem. A little bit time consuming to get all that paint off, but it came off fairly easily, and I'll show you that in a second or two. So I am going to separate this chain set down into its component form so that we can really do a nice deep clean on there. Same with the rear derailleur. I'm going to remove the jockey wheels, get everything clean, make sure that everything's lubricated correctly and everything is nice when it goes back on the bike. So that's what I'm doing there, just separate all the components. There's only a few bits going to go in the ultrasonic cleaner on this one, that being the cassette and the chainring bolts. That is all we are putting through the ultrasonic cleaner on this one. The rest we were able to just wash down, so we're using soapy water to wash off that ultrasonic solution off of this component, and you can see how lovely this cassette is cleaning up. Campagnolo is just really a step up from Shimano and other makes and brands. The quality of their components is next level. And it's always a treat to do any bike with this on it. These Italian bikes really are beautiful. They just have that next level of engineering that really makes them a pleasure. Whenever I get these Bianchis into the shop, I am always ready to go on it, so I always enjoy doing these. Lovely group set, this one. Quite an old group set now, but none the more for that, it worked perfectly on the bike. So everything there we're just washing off. Once it's washed off like this, I will then dry it off with a microfiber towel, clean it down, make sure it's dry, blow it out with an airline before I start to lubricate and clean any of the parts up after the wash down. I'm going to clean the jockey wheels with a little bit of degreaser, just spray it onto a rag, wipe them down. That's all I needed. It's just a nice way of getting nice and tactile with them without flushing out any bearings. These didn't actually have a bearing. These were the ones with the center bushing that we are just going to lubricate there with our Bike Speeds premium grease to make sure that they're nice and rotate on the bike nicely. A little bit of thread locker inside the derailleur housing itself. On go the jockey wheels, and you can actually see the right hand pivot there. The bolt on the bottom right hand side there has got a little bit of residue of thread locker still on it from previous. That's why we do those, to make sure that these don't come unwound on the derailleur and cause an issue. Now this thumb adjuster was an absolute joy. You forget sometimes, I don't do Campagnolo very often, but this has such a tactile feel. A little clickety click as it's turning. Really the thumb adjuster out there. What a lovely thumb adjuster that one was. So as with all our servicing, we put a little bit of premium grease on the spring to stop corrosion. We use our general purpose oil with that little needle applicator on all the pivot points of the derailleurs. Same with the front. A little bit of premium grease to stop the spring corroding. A little bit of our general purpose oil onto the pivot points of the derailleur. We'll do this with any group set we have when we're servicing it, just to help everything move and actuate nicely. Now the front brake was in a sorry state really. You can see there we had a bit of corrosion on the mounting bolt, so I'm going to clean that off, and I'm just using a brass bristled brush there to just clean off that excess corrosion that's on there, and then when we put this back together we'll lubricate that to try and stop that happening again. Now what we found worked really well with this paint was methylated spirits, so we cleaned it off with that. We just wetted it slightly first, that softened up the paint, and then we were able to use a little bit more methylated spirits on a rag to really work in and clean that off. And this is sped up quite considerably. It was quite time consuming to get this off, a labour of love, but we wanted to get off all that paint residue from that splashdown that this bike had, so that's what we did. Now again with brakes, they're often missed, but we're going to lubricate that, a little bit of our general purpose oil, and this is where we use our silicone grease. We don't use it very often, but we've got a metal spring running through a plastic fitting, and it's perfect for that kind of thing. Metal on rubber, metal on plastic, that's where we use our silicone grease. So again with the skewer, we're lubricating that all the way along. General purpose oil on the actuating arm, general purpose grease along the shaft, and a little bit of copper grease on the threads at the end. Same with the chain set, I'm using a little bit of our copper grease on the threads of the bolts that hold it together, and a general purpose grease on the splines themselves. This is more of a preventative maintenance for me, from the point of view of next time I come to take this apart, if I put a little bit of grease on those splines, it will just help everything come apart again in the future, causing no corrosion between servicing. So that's why I tend to do those. And then we're just going to pop these together with the bolts that have been greased to make sure that everything there is right. And then I will also torque these on the bench before they go back on the bike. The front chain set, front derailleur, is a left and right action across the bike, so I like to get those in their final torqued position so that everything there is right when it's on the bike for adjustments of the front derailleur. And now I'm going to start working on the wheels. So you can see there we had this paint residue again splashed down over the wheel, so I'm going to clean all that paint off of there, get that nice, and then I'm going to use one of our detailing brushes to wash this wheel down. All the various products that you see in these videos we do sell online. There's a link to our website in the description below, so if there's anything here you see that you think may help you with your maintenance on your bikes, the greases, the detailing brushes, various things that we use, cabling on other videos, there's a whole host of things on our website that you can buy. So do check that out when you're doing your own maintenance. Now, the idea of doing this with a wheel where I wash it down and I check everything is to really check the wheel. The back wheel itself, the tyre was rotating the wrong way, so I actually rotated the rotation of the rear tyre, and obviously the front wheel, we're going to do the puncture on that, which you'll see. But things like this cassette here was a real joy. It's all separate with its little spacers, really tactile to put that together, and you can see how beautiful and clean that came up, and how easy it is to clean where every single cog is a separate piece to each other. So that's a real pleasure to do that. Now you can see here the front tyre had this bit of debris inside the tyre, so we're just going to pick that out. You can see there a little bit of flint. That would have been what caused the puncture on this bike. If we hadn't cleared that out, we'd have had an instant new puncture. Now, you've seen this in other videos. I do like to line up the logos with the valve itself, and we're literally turning this one spoke width to get that logo central to the valve. And it's just a detail that I think is important to do, and it's the level of servicing that we do at Bike Speed. So I'm going to actually rotate this tyre just slightly, one spoke width, just to get that absolutely spot on and nice. But we are also going to replace that inner tube. The old one obviously had that puncture, so we'll put a fresh one in, make sure that everything here is nice and pressurized and correct for the bike. So that's going in now. So we'll just work that tyre on. I seat that tyre in the center of the tyre, working it round. No need to use levers to put tyres back on. And then once that's back on, I can inflate that. So I inflate these to 6 bar usually on this type of road bike and this type of tyre. You may also have noticed in the befores that the valve cap was missing on the rear tyre, so we also replaced that. Now you can see here the buckle that is in that front wheel, so it's important for me to get this correct. So what I will do once I've seen this buckle and see how bad it is, I will measure all the tensions on the spokes, which you can see there on the left, see where some are too tight, some are too loose. So I'll work my way around the wheel until I get the tensions absolutely spot on, as you can see there now on the graph. These are all within 5% of each other, and you can see on this before how we had on the 1 o'clock position, one spoke too tight, another too loose, and the ones each side of that were too tight. So we bring that tolerance within the 5% of each other, and you can see there on that finishing graph how nice this wheel actually ended up. And then our final bit of paint on this bike was on the forks, so you can see how that is dissolving away with methylated spirits. Again, this is sped up quite considerably, but it was nice that we could get that off without damaging the lacquer or the paint on this lovely Bianchi. I mean, look at the paint on that. Love these bikes. You can even see there that the saddle has that green detailing in it. It has this lovely leather handlebar tape, and we're washing this down with our nice big softy brush, a lovely soft nylon bristled brush. We don't want to go too wet on this bike, so although this looks like we're washing it down, you'll see there's no drips of water coming away from this bike. We don't tend to get bikes too wet. We don't want to flush out bearings or over wet bikes. It's unnecessary. So we just wash these down in a nice subtle way, a nice tactile way, and then we're using our microfiber towels here to really dry this bike off. So these will absorb out all that moisture we've put on the bike, along with pulling off all the dirt and debris that's on it, and it absolutely came up beautifully. Next up, we're going to start putting the bike back together. So initially I'm going to use our premium grease on the shaft of the chain set to make sure that goes into the bearings nicely, put those spacers back on, put the pedal arm back on. This has its own extraction system on this left hand pedal arm, but once that's back on we can torque that up. Again, as I mentioned, I like to get the front derailleur, chain set, everything torqued up prior to adjusting the front derailleur. So we're reusing the front derailleur cable as well. Again, the cables on this bike were in good condition. I don't actually think this bike had done many miles. It just needed this recommissioning service. The rider of this bike was telling me that she'd had a bad neck injury or neck problem of some description that had seen her out of riding for around 3 years, and this was her baby bike that she loved and enjoyed. So we're recommissioning it, and hopefully it will help her on her journey to full recovery, and that she can get back into cycling and begin to enjoy this beautiful, beautiful bike again. So I'm going to put a little bit of copper grease on the shaft of the mount for the brakes, both front and rear, because we did have that corrosion problem on the brake mounts. And the lovely thing again with this group set is that where Shimano on the front forks, that fitting sits inside the forks. With this one it sits on the outside. It's got a nice flush mounting so you don't get the water and debris inside the forks like you do on Shimano. This is what I'm talking about here. So you can see that lovely big head on there, where Shimano has a much narrower one that will sit inside the forks. This sits from one end to the other and there's a nice tight fitting on the forks. I am going to use a little bit of our general purpose grease on this thread. You know that we usually use copper grease on our threads, but this is aluminium to aluminium. The actual adjuster's aluminium, as is the actual caliper itself, so that's why we use general purpose grease there. Now on go the wheels. We're really looking good now, and on goes our new chain. I hope you are enjoying this video. If you are, please hit that subscribe button. You've got to help us out. We all go on about hitting the subscribe button. Today's your turn. Hit that subscribe button for Bike Speeds, and then you will see all our future videos as they come out. That chain is one of our own Taya chains. It's a lovely silver chain, beautiful finish, lovely chrome finish on this chain. Changes gear perfectly on Campagnolo, as you can see here, beautifully up and down all the gears. We check and adjust those gears, and then we make sure all the brakes are working. So the back brake is working perfectly, actuating nicely. We've got the same even amount of pull both sides of the rim, so I know that everything's central. And then one thing I noticed with this, which was really odd, was that the handlebars weren't central to the stem. It was around about 5mm out, which is a considerable amount really. You're riding sort of off to one side. Wouldn't help a neck injury or this rider to recover from a neck injury, so we squared those up. And I did consult the customer about doing this, where thankfully she hadn't cut a steerer tube. She had some spaces above the stem, which we were able to put under the stem, which again will give her a little bit more of an upright position as she recovers and gets used to riding the bike again. So that's why we did that. We swapped those around, but that's a great reason for not actually cutting your steerer tube, that you can move it up and down as you change as a rider along the journey of your bike. Sometimes slamming these stems and cutting them down is not best practice because things can change. The brake levers and shifters were actually loose on this bike, so we torqued those up. You remember I moved the handlebars across, squared those up to make sure that they were in the center, so obviously I need to torque up the crown bolts there. The stem, we've also raised that steerer tube and that stem, so we need to torque that. We also need to torque the brakes. We obviously turned this brake when we cleaned that paint off, so we need to make sure everything there is right. Obviously the brakes came off the bike, so I need to torque that. Pedals, always a good idea to check your pedals. I often see these where they're either too loose or too tight, so I make sure the pedals are correct. And again, the rear brake, make sure things like the pinch bolts are tight, the pads themselves are tight, the mounts are tight, and then I know that everything in the braking system is absolutely as it should be. And obviously we took the derailleur off, so I'm going to also torque that. Although we didn't take this off, you can see here the saddle did need torquing. There was a little bit of movement in the bolts that hold that saddle on, and this seat post clamp was very loose, so I also tightened that. I also noticed while we were cleaning this bike down that these accessory bolts were actually very loose in the frame. They were actually rattling, so we don't want that to fall out, so we tightened those as well. And as you can see from these before and afters, it's a very subtle service, this one, but it's made a massive difference to this bike. This bike will now ride beautifully, change gear nicely, and everything will work as it should. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe, please do like, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.